Christopher Emmanuel Paul, who rose to national prominence when he famously scored 61 points in his senior year at West Forsyth High in Clemmons, North Carolina, in order to honor his grandfather who was murdered earlier that year at the age of 61. He eventually would parlay his McDonald's High School All-American status into a 2-year stint at Wake Forest University, where in between crotch-punching competitors, a tactic which he would deploy later on into his NBA career. Paul would also be named first-team consensus All-American in his sophomore season before choking in the second round of the NCAA tournament that same season, hiring an agent and declaring for the NBA draft, where the New Orleans Hornets would select him with the 4th overall pick in the 2005 NBA draft.
The New Orleans Hornets select Chris Paul.
And now, all of a sudden, playing in his 19th season with his 6th NBA team, all while going on to play in one total NBA Final Series. Many believe he has amassed a total career resume that should land him in GOAT point guard discussions, with one prominent blowhard national pundit even dubbing him the Point God.
He is the point guard. Honestly, the best point guard in basketball.
But just what exactly has Paul actually accomplished in his career that would justify this kind of classification with the all-time greats? Well, his impressive individual statistical accomplishments started as soon as he hit the court in his first NBA season at the age of just 20. Coming up just one vote shy of unanimous Rookie of the Year honors, averaging 16 points, 8 assists, 5 rebounds, and 2.2 steals per game. By his 3rd year in the league at the age of 22, Paul would be named an All-Star for the first time.
Here we go. Here we go. Now another.
Starting a string of 9 consecutive All-Star appearances for him, and overall, now in 18 years, he has 12 All-Star teams to his resume, along with 4 first-team All-NBA selections, 5 second-team honors, and 2 third-team distinctions. He also has 9 All-NBA defensive team selections, 7 of which being via the first team. Paul has led the NBA in assists 5 times throughout his career and in steals 6 times. Yes, there is no doubt Chris Paul is one of the most individually decorated point guards in NBA history. But what has all of that individual success meant to his team's success during his now 19-year career and counting? Well, Chris Paul has been to the playoffs in 15 of his full 18 NBA seasons, which includes the last 13 consecutive years. And despite Paul being a top 4 seed in the conference 11 times, he has made it past the second round of the playoffs only 2 times in his entire career and made it to just one NBA Final Series. Again, in 18 years. A final series where he was up 2-0 with home court advantage and lost 4 consecutive games in. And speaking of blown 2-0 leads, the point god has blown a total of 5 2-0 leads in his postseason career, the most for any player in NBA history, along with a blown 2-1 lead and that infamous blown 3-1 lead in the 2015 playoffs against, of all people, the GOAT playoff choker himself, Little Game James Harden. CP3 is looking suspiciously like a worse playoff closer than his banana boat buddy. And in all, Paul has been eliminated 7 times in his playoff career when his team has held a lead at some point in those series. While Chris Paul didn't markedly do anything to outright choke or cost his team games throughout his playoff tenure, and while he does boast some of the most eye-popping advanced analytical metrics that the nerd media obviously cannot get enough of, it is undeniable he has underachieved throughout his playoff career, being eliminated in the postseason 6 times to a lower-seeded team.
What?
while amassing an underwhelming 76-73 playoff record, which is barely over 500 for his career. Meanwhile, in the regular season, Paul is 789-432, a win percentage of nearly 65%. Something is simply not matching up when Chris Paul gets into the postseason, and herein lies the fundamental issue. Not strictly with just Chris Paul, but with all players. There are a lot of really great players who have populated the league throughout the history of organized professional basketball. Sloppily jamming certain players into the greatest designation without fully understanding or looking at players and generations that preceded them is the root cause of many of these arguments and GOAT cases falling flat on their faces when you actually do dig into them. And in the case of the point fraud, Chris Paul, lumping him into GOAT point guard arguments is so utterly lazy and pathetic. Not because Chris Paul sucks or is a terrible player, but because when you look at the other players in this conversation, it becomes glaringly apparent that Paul doesn't belong anywhere near the top spot. And speaking of that top spot, the obvious and clear-cut greatest point guard of all time has to be three-time league MVP Magic Johnson, with career averages of 19.5 points, 11 assists, and 7 rebounds per game. But his career went far beyond that, as the Magic Man pioneered the rise of Showtime in LA, while going to 9 NBA Finals and winning 5 in what amounted to just a 12-year career. Likely, there would also be little pushback to Oscar Robertson going above Chris Paul, as Mr. Triple-Double averaged nearly 26 points, 9.5 assists, and 7.5 rebounds per game, winning the league MVP in 1964 and a championship on one of the greatest teams ever as a member of the Milwaukee Bucks in the 1970-71 season. But one of the most severely underrated players in terms of this conversation, and one that must be put above the likes of a career loser in Chris Paul, has to be Isaiah Thomas, boasting career averages of 19 points, 9 assists, and 2 steals per game. But the crowning achievement of Thomas's career was going to 3 consecutive NBA Finals in the 1980s, and doing it from the powerhouse Eastern Conference. This decade saw one of the greatest teams in NBA history, the 1983 Moses Malone and Julius Erving-led Philadelphia 76ers, the Dominique Wilkins Atlanta Hawks, a perennial 50-win Milwaukee Bucks team, Michael Jordan, and of course, the legendary Larry Bird Boston Celtics. While in the back end of that decade came the Reggie Miller Pacers and the Patrick Ewing New York Knicks. There were no easy series in the Eastern Conference playoffs during that time, yet Isaiah Thomas was the catalyst of a team that went to 3 straight finals, winning back-to-back championships and falling short of a likely three-peat only due to Isaiah's severely sprained ankle in Game 6 of the 1988 Finals. A series the Pistons still took the Magic and Kareem Lakers the distance to a Game 7 and lost by just 3 points in. And if one guy deserves to be in this conversation, despite never reaching the promised land and achieving the ultimate goal, it is not Chris Paul. It is the quintessential point guard, John Stockton, who led the NBA in assists a staggering 9 years in a row and has 3,715 more assists than Jason Kidd, who is second on the all-time list. For some perspective on that gap, Kyrie Irving has 3,888 assists currently for his entire career. In addition to this, Stockton is also the all-time steals leader in NBA history with 581 more than second place on that list, which is also Jason Kidd. Speaking of Kidd, just how and when did Chris Paul exactly surpass him? Kidd is second on that aforementioned all-time assists and steals list. He appeared in 3 NBA Finals series and won one of those championships. He has 5 All-NBA first-team selections at the point slot, one more than CP3 achieved throughout his career, and Kidd was named All-NBA defensive team 9 times, same as Paul. Also garnering consideration in this conversation, players like Walt Frazier, who won 2 championships in the 1970s with the New York Knicks, and criminally disrespected Bob Cousy, the Houdini of the hardwood. Cousy led the NBA in assists for 8 consecutive seasons, won league MVP in 1957, was named All-NBA First Team 10 times, has career averages of 18 points, 7 assists, 5 rebounds, and won 6 NBA championships. In fact, instead of referring to him as a plumber,
well, you know, he was being guarded by plumbers and firemen.
Perhaps we should be calling him the GOAT, at the very least, discussing him up near the top of this list. Meanwhile, for the alleged point god, Chris Paul, his career comps align more favorably with a player like Steve Nash, which has Paul even comfortably cleared 2-time league MVP Steve Nash. All of this is without even classifying Steph Curry as a point guard, since despite being listed as a point, he realistically should be designated as a 2. Same goes for the logo Jerry West, as if we are classifying them as point guards for purposes of historical, all-time discussions. They also both go above CP3. And we haven't even gotten into the guy who has averaged a triple-double for 4 full NBA seasons. But you guys likely aren't ready to admit he also easily clears Cliff Paul. GOAT point guard? More like barely top 10 point guard, as upon doing a deeper dive into the supposed GOAT case of yet another modern era player, the point frauds case crumbles, just like mostly every other fraudulent case of many of this era's most overrated players.